first plenary. So I have the great pleasure of introducing Dr. Craig Allen, who is an adjunct professor in the Department of Geography and Environmental Studies at the University of New Mexico, and a very recently retired research ecologist and founding leader of the New Mexico Landscapes Field Station for the U.S. Geological Survey, based out of the Bandelier National Monument in the Hammond Mountains of New Mexico. Craig is really renowned for his work on the drivers of global tree mortality, and in 2010 was named a Fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science based on his many important and valuable contributions. He's also loved trees since he was a child growing up in Wisconsin. Dr. Hammond very recently completed his PhD at the University of Oklahoma State University, and had an amazing defense. It was amazing to watch, and has made already very significant contributions to understanding the external drivers of mortality, such as climate change and biotic agents, and the internal mechanisms related to plant physiological processes. So Bill is about to bring in a 2-year NSF postdoc at another OSU, this time in Oregon State University, and welcomes an adventure in the Pacific Northwest. All right, please take it away.
All right, thank you, Jody. And I'm putting my 15-minute timer on right now. It's moving. So yeah, so Bill and I are going to tag team this talk. I'm going to do the first 15 minutes. Bill's going to do the second. And our talk, as you see, listening to the trees, but really how observations, global tree mortality observations, in the end, what does it tell us about the fate of Earth's forests, Earth's historical forests in this world of increasing hotter drought? And what these changes mean for forests near and far, including how it drives disturbance processes, which you all in California have had your fair share the last several years. My take on this, I've had the sort of the distinct pleasure and opportunity to spend 40 years in this landscapes here in the Southern Rocky Mountains, based out of the Hammond Mountains, starting in the early 80s. This is the 41st year I'm doing field work in these landscapes in a row. And when I came in the 80s, these landscapes, it was a wet period. It was actually, in the tree ring record, the best period of growth for forests in the last 1,000 years, period from like 78 to 95. But by 2000, we were in regional scale drought, and 2002 was particularly brutal. And to a significant degree, my career has been, it turns out, based on documenting that transition from the good times that were rolling in the 80s and early 90s for forests and everything associated with that, to how these landscapes have been changing. And so I've been documenting at the scale of plots and using a variety of lines of evidence, but just literally documenting at the scale of individual trees, tree growth, the plot level, this transition of what's happening with drought stress and temperature related to it, killing trees, this kind of before after. But 2002, nobody could avoid looking at it. This is fall of 2002, and 18 months later, those are all co-dominants, Pinus edulis, and it took out 95% of them in the whole eastern flank of this mountain range, centered on where I live. So you can't not study this when you're based in this part of the world. This is what it looks like on the ground. I mean, literally an almost overnight transformation of so many things in terms of how these ecosystems function. With many colleagues, it's clear this was a regional scale event, and from, scaling up everything from plots to remote sensing work, it was about 1 million hectares of pinon mortality, but similar amounts of ponderosa pine and other conifers as well. You can also, other ways to get perspectives on these kinds of drought stresses through tree rings. And so this is kind of a now emergent classic paper by Park Williams, who's now at UCLA, came out in 2013 in print, but used tree rings to look at temperature as a potent driver of regional forest drought stress and tree mortality. Well, so what does that mean? Park basically looked at all of the available tree ring growth chronologies, 335 chronologies across that yellow shaded area, basically the monsoonal Southwest, all the tree, hundreds of thousands of annual growth measurements, and put together this regional record of tree growth. And this is the overlap back to 1895 with the instrumental record, climate record for the region. And it turned out Park did something quite interesting. The big deal on this was that with two climate variables preceding winter spring precip and growing season daily max temperature averaged monthly, which he also converted to vapor pressure deficit here. With those just two variables, he could predict, you see the R-squared values down there in the lower to, 0.91 an R value. It's the strongest tree ring climate prediction of tree growth. And it applies only at that regional scale, which is where the analysis was done, although it does turn out that it looks like individual landscapes show similar patterns. But the strength of that relationship also allows us then to work backwards and forwards with this. So this forest drought stress index is just that two variable predictor. And by the way, the temperature variable component of that was half the strength of that prediction of that relationship. And so basically when it's hotter during the growing season, trees grow more poorly. That was the big news out of this story. But when you look at this, so here's a 1,000-year reconstruction of regional forest growth in the Southwest back to, 81,000 through 2007. The red is a 10-year smooth. The gray are the individual years. Above the line was good growth and unstressed conditions, and the stresses below the line. Well, there are a couple of arrows pointing out a couple of extreme droughts. The two worst there in the late 1200s and the late 1500s, mega droughts that were well known through tree ring work previously. The 1950s drought shows up there towards the right. We know from things like the 50s drought that it killed trees. Some of us have documented that. So that dashed line was a little bit arbitrary, but at sort of this -5 FDSI level, sort of a threshold of tree killing drought stress that we imagine has gone on historically. And then I just want to highlight one particular year. Down in the bottom right corner, that green circle, that's the year 2002. Objectively, through 2007, the previous 1,000 years, 2002 by far was the worst year for tree growth regionally. We don't believe it's because it was drier than in the middle of some of these extreme multi-decadal length drought spells, but it's the synergy with the warming. This is the role of warming temperature in terms of amplifying that drought stress on tree growth. And it also lets us, because this prediction, this FDSI is such a strong relationship to tree growth, it's basically an empirical model of tree growth in the future if you can plug the climate parameters in, which of course there are GCMs that do that in terms of predicting precip and temp moving forward. And when you do that and run ensembles of sort of moderate level climate change temperature, basically, if not the most extreme levels. The bad news of this is, so here's moving forward, the black is the historical tree growth that we actually measure. This is running the model through the middle of it, historically with historical data and then forward into the future. But the bad news is by mid-century, by about 2050, the mean conditions of all these model runs start to exceed the worst years of the most extreme mega droughts, and by the second half of the century. For conifers, for gymnosperms, that which these tree rings are based on, it doesn't look good, at least in the places where these historical forests have grown. It's not just tree growth that's affected, but it turns out temperature is also a major synergy amplifier of major forest disturbance processes, fire, drought stress, direct die-off, and biotic agents like beetles. Fire is not the theme of the talk that Bill and I are giving, but we've had our share that this mega drought with warm temperatures in the Southwest is driven. I mean, these are all pictures just in the landscape that I inhabit. And it's been some very profound changes that you're experiencing now as well. Certainly you're seeing, You've become the poster child, I would say, in California, and I'm not talking about. I'm looking forward to learning more and hearing more soon, but certainly the tree mortality that Jody just described, the fire mortality that we're going to hear about, just astounding what happened. Extreme events. Last year, you had major extreme event. But I'm going to talk a little bit now about scaling this up. So from these local observations in my home landscape here in the Jemez Mountains, it wasn't just Pinus edulis in the woodland zone in the lower mesas, but it was all up and down the elevational gradient, all different woody plants, but also even the grasses. 2/3 of the dominant grass cover, blue grama, died back in 02, 03, down in those same woodlands where the piñons died. When we scale and look regionally through aerial detection surveys, this is bark beetle outbreaks mapped from 97 to 12. All this should be updated, but it was about 12% of the forest and woodland area of the region. If you looked at tree killing fire, and that's another 7% or so, it's almost 20% through 2012 of the forested portion of this region was severely affected by tree killing disturbance in that time period. It wasn't just in the Southwest. This has been going on across all of Western North America. As you all know, this is just the first decade of the 2000s through a bark beetle lens perspective on it. But underlying all that is the drought stress affecting those host trees. And it turns out that similar things are going on around the world. And as I was starting to interact with people, had the opportunity with 20 colleagues, and we put together this first global overview of drought, of published documentation in the scientific literature of forest die-off sites from drought and heat stress, which I've updated a couple times through other publications. And so the bottom line out of all of this is that globally, we can see that all forest types are already vulnerable, and that there's some big information gaps that really constrain our ability to document and predict tree mortality in response to projected climate change. Part of the reason this talk is about emphasizing observations is trying to think about sort of these observation-based empirical models, because process models of tree mortality are really difficult. It's a tree mortality model that physiologically, quantitatively, really difficult, sort of early multiple factor things, but the more the tree physiologists look, we see there's all kinds of interactions going on in there, and the ability to model these things realistically in the broad scale Earth system models or dynamic global vegetation models is quite limited currently. In fact, I would assert that still none of these models realistically project tree mortality. We can barely maybe do it for a handful of individual species in a processed way, but every tree species on the planet is different, and there's somewhere between 60 and 100,000 tree species on this planet, and they all behave individualistically across landscape. One of the big uncertainties, by the way, is number 3 in this diagram, this vortex of mortality that with a couple colleagues I put together a few years ago. Well, I didn't put it together, collectively we did. This is actually Dave Brashears wanted this one figure, but number 3 here over in the right hand at sort of the 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock position, CO2 fertilization, water use efficiency. The effect of that is a big deal, and it's incorporated into the models in ways that we're not sure how that's going to proceed. And some of us think that we're essentially underestimating the vulnerability of forests to tree mortality moving forward, in part because it's really difficult. The baselines are moving. Forests are rooted where they are. Particularly, this is a big deal for historical forests, as I'll discuss in a moment, but it's the challenge of predicting unforeseen threshold, nonlinear tipping point responses to increasingly novel and extreme drought and heat events. The baselines are moving up, our background temperatures are increasing, but the extreme events are also increasing. They're superimposed on top of that, and apparently the extremes are increasing as well. And it turns out this is particularly bad news for big and old trees on this planet. This is true, it seems, empirically, in terms of what does it take to move water to the top of a tree. It's harder to get at the top of against gravity to a tall tree than a shorter tree. And we see it empirically in plots in many places on the world. Now, it's not, there's places where small trees die too, of course, in these events, but I raise this because big old trees are important. This is what's at stake. Historical forests, they're the iconic charismatic mega flora of planet Earth. And these ancient iconic trees have meanings for people. They matter for so many reasons, ranging from biodiversity values, a whole array of other ecosystem services, watershed hydrology, for example, in the Amazon. Half the precip is recycled, half the rainfall that falls there is recycled by the system, and large trees, the emergent trees, are contributing over a quarter of that. And the whole forest as a whole, it's a third. Scientific values, we already mentioned tree rings, the ability, there's so much information, but in big old trees, the global carbon balance, super important in this world. A very cool paper by Jim Lutz and others. Out of more than 5.5 million tree stems in old growth forests worldwide. And it turns out that the largest 1% of trees by diameter that these largest trees are half the forest above ground forest biomass, and as much as 80% in some tropical forests are those largest 1% of trees. Economic values, human cultural values, ethical reasons, intrinsic values. Anyway, big old trees matter for a lot of reasons. And as we see, the world's getting warmer. We know that. We can see it empirically. It's projected. It's going to continue to get warmer. It's baked in right now, the inertia. We hope it doesn't go to 4 and 5 degrees C this century, but we're going to see more. And at just 1 degree, we're seeing these impacts. So what does this mean? To close and transition to Bill, this recent paper last year that there's pretty much a consensus emerging that forests are going to become from older to younger because of these disturbance processes, and that they'll be shorter statured, the species composition is going to change, and Bill's now going to take these forest die-off sites around the planet to another level. So I close there. So Bill, take it away.
All right, you can all hear me and see we're on the same map Craig left us on. Good. All right, well, thank you, Craig, for kicking this off. Like Craig said, I'm gonna take this map to a different level. And I guess what that means is in 2019, the way I met Craig is I emailed him asking for the data behind this map. And I said, I'd like the latitudes and longitudes. And Craig said, well, give me a call. And after a long discussion, what I came to realize is that this map is very effective at demonstrating its purpose of the global extent of mortality, but that these points weren't precisely geo-referenced to the extent that we could know exactly where, like down to the kilometer, this elevated tree mortality had happened. And Craig said, that's going to take a lot more work. And being a naive graduate student at the time, maybe I still am in some ways, I said, I could do that. And what I didn't know is that the data wasn't in the papers. It was going to take so many data requests. I sent emails. I sent a lot of emails to a lot of people who had been studying their local forest, just like Craig had on his landscape in New Mexico, and documenting mortality carefully and attributing it to drought and heat. And I had this kind of search image as I went through over 200 papers, looking at these peer-reviewed mortality events where mortality was elevated and it was attributed in some way to drought, heat, or both. And it was important to me that these be ground-based observations. Even though remote methods exist, I wanted like a global data set of ground-based validation of where trees are dying in large numbers. The second thing was I had to work with those local expertise of the study authors to understand what was elevated mortality in their forest. It's different in a wet versus a dry forest, for example. And when did mortality begin? To the best of their understanding of their system, when did this mortality event kick off in time? And so after doing all of that, what we ended up with, I'm going to step you through an animation here. In the 1970s are some of the oldest mortality events in this peer-reviewed database that I'm going to show you, and we'll move forward in time to 2018. And as the years keep ticking, we're going to see these mortality events pop onto the map. And the database now has over 1,300 plots, over 150 dominant species, over 150 of those papers ended up being retained in the database. And it spans this 48 years of mortality. And as you can see, just like on the maps Craig was putting together, it covers all of the forested continents of Earth. And by the time we get here to 2018, it looks pretty bad, right? And although this map looks really similar to what Craig was showing you, now that it's precisely georeferenced down to the plot level, it's also locally really data rich and information rich. You can look in this aspen mortality in southern Canada that we have a lot of plots. It's locally plot dense, right? The same thing can be seen in Southwest Australia. And so now we have the information about precisely where and precisely when some of these mortality events can happen. So we can ask the data and really ask the forests what the climate was like during this mortality across the most recent 5 decades on Earth. And the first thing that we wanted to ask the trees here was what types of biomes have experienced mortality. I'm showing you what's called a Whitaker biome framework. It paints with a really broad brush in terms of annual temperature on the X and annual precipitation on the Y, and it puts all of the diversity, that 100,000 species Craig was telling you about, into like 9 bins of biome. And if we add our 1,300 plots to it, what we'll see is that across over 30 degrees Celsius in temperature gradient and almost 4 meters of annual precipitation gradient, no matter what the mean or average climate of a forest is, eventually a hotter drought can cause an elevated mortality event just about anywhere, climatically speaking. And so we can see from the map that trees are dying on every forested continent and in every forested biome. And this is not especially new information. We knew this from the broad spatial extent maps that Craig had been putting together for the last decade. But what we really wanted to ask, now that we have this precisely georeferenced version of the database with many more plots, is what can this recent forest mortality across Earth tell us about what might be a set of lethal climate conditions for trees in terms of how hot is too hot and how dry is too dry. To give you an example of what I mean, we'll just zoom in on this one point. Every point on the map now, we can look at the climate that was associated with mortality. This is a plot in Costa Rica from a study of Dr. Jennifer Powers. And in 2015, there was a mortality event. This is a drought severity index, kind of like the drought index Craig was showing you. And when it's red, it's bad, it's dry. And you can see in 2015, it was a pretty dry situation when this forest had mortality. And again, we know there was mortality because there were ground-based measurements. Here's a photo from Dr. Powers that she shared with me of some of the canopy mortality there. And so behind each one of these points now, we can investigate what was the climate like. But we're not just worried about drought. Like Craig said, we think warming is a major driver of these events. And it's something that we have a lot of reason to be concerned about because the warming's not done yet, is it? And I'm a tree ecophysiologist. I'm one of these mechanistic, process-based people that Craig was just talking about. And I spent my whole dissertation wondering about what kills trees. And the way I think about warming is I think it poses a triple threat to tree survival because it amplifies atmospheric aridity. It increases the vapor pressure deficit, which is effectively the atmosphere's demand of moisture from plants. It also intensifies soil drought by increasing evaporation and evapotranspiration, so that as trees are being asked to give more water above, they're running out below. And on top of all of that, heat can basically impact plants directly with direct heat stress. And the major mode of ameliorating heat stress for any plant physiologically is just to use some water and evaporatively cool. But if it's a top drought, of course, this is a really bad plan because water is limiting. And so proceeding from this triple threat, our hypothesis is that the months of the mortality years might be even hotter and even drier than the typically warmest and driest months. So the extreme times when it's already hot and dry in a forest, if that gets much hotter or much drier than average, that could be what we see crop up in these mortality years. And months seems like a pretty short time scale to an organism like a tree, especially after Craig just showed us these historical forests and these, 1,000-year-old large trees. But again, as a physiologist, I must admit to you that I've been killing a lot of trees the last 5 years myself and watching them die, because if you want to know about the mechanisms and how much they can take, you've got to push them to the breaking point. And I've gotten really granular with it. I go all the way down into the xylem and see how many pipes have to break before a tree can die. And I don't have time to go into all of that today, but I just wanted to tell you that this has left me with the impression that for trees and forests, there really is a thin line between life and death. Although they can live long, and dying might take years or even decades in some cases, the transition between living and dying could exist in a thin space. And these extreme events, when it's really hot and really dry, could be those moments that trees break. The questions we wanted to ask of this hypothesis was, can we detect a global climate signal, a hotter drought fingerprint on Earth's forest mortality sites using this database of globally distributed and temporally distributed hotter drought tree mortality events? And then 2, how often is that fingerprint going to show up if Earth continues to warm? Is it going to come around more frequently? Is it possible that these climate conditions associated with the most recent decades of forced mortality on the planet might come around more often? And if so, how often? So I'm going to answer those two questions for you now with some data. The first one, I'm going to walk you through a lot of plots, so I'll set up the plot real quick. On the y-axis here are 6 climate variables, the maximum average monthly temperature up here and that drought index at the bottom. They're all getting at, is it cool and wet or is it hot and dry? At the top of the plot, I'm going to show you 9 years. We're going to step through 9 years of sequence from 4 years before the mortality event to 4 years after. So I'm going to take all of these, 48 years of tree mortality and center them on the mortality years so that we can see what the climate variation was like leading up to and after mortality. And then I'm going to show you the data as these little dots. If they're in the middle, these are z-scores. It's a way to compare metrics on different scales in comparison to their long-term trend. If they're in the middle, they're not different from long-term climate. If they're on the left, it's going to indicate that it's cooler or wetter. If they're on the right and they're red, it's going to be because they're warmer and drier. So anyways, we'll start 4 years before mortality of Earth's forests. And what we see is a pretty interesting thing. These whiskers are 95% confidence. So most of these variables, it's actually cooler and wetter 4 years before mortality. 3 years before, it's pretty similar to the long-term trend. The same thing 2 years before, a lot of the metrics close to the long-term trend. A year before the mortality began, for the first time, we see all 6 of these climate metrics across the very diverse in species composition and forest composition sites. All of them are showing a significantly hotter, drier signal. And the mortality year, this intensifies to the maximum that we'll see across this chronology I'm showing you today. This signal of being warmer and drier persists for a year afterwards, even though precipitation's kind of returned to normal. And then 2, 3, and 4 years after, things kind of return to normal. So if we zoom out and look at all 9 of these years at once, that's what I'm showing you here is all 9 of them. We're going to move from 4 years prior to 4 years after the mortality event. And this hotter drought fingerprint in the middle is really when these metrics kind of during the typically warmest and driest months intensify the most. They get the most warmer or the most drier relative to the long term. And it's interesting that across these really diverse forests, we can see that signal somewhat consistently. And so now that we've quantified how hot's too hot and how dry is too dry, is that amount of variation from long-term climate going to increase with warming? And if so, by how much? So to ask this question, what we did was use 2 pseudo-warming scenarios where we warmed our observed climate data by 2C or by 4C. And you'll notice something in this soil drought here. This is PDSI. And not only do the means shift drier here, negative is drier on this axis, but also you'll notice the extremes get more extreme. The distribution's also kind of squished down, right? And so the tails move out further. Look at how much of this climate space is outside of observation. We don't really know what's going to happen there. That's another reason that people like Craig and myself feel like this could be something we're potentially underestimating. The same thing happens with the vapor pressure deficit anomaly. I flipped the axis so that left is drier here also. And of course, as we warm the mean temperature, the extreme temperatures, the maximum temperatures go up even more. And so this kind of increasing the extremes, what does it do to the frequency of that lethal climate fingerprint? Well, if our baseline condition is here in terms of the years per decade that those mortality conditions existed across Earth's forest sites, it goes up by about 22% if we move to plus 2C over pre-industrial. We're at 0.7 today on average around the Earth. But if we go to plus 4C warming, it goes up 140%. So you'll notice the line connecting these 3 bars is not straight, it's a curve. And if 2020 and coronavirus taught us anything about curves, it's that they're to be avoided when the outcome is not something you want to see, like a bunch of dead trees, right? And so this is just an exponential fit. And so this gives us some cause, and this is how we can listen to the trees and their mortality across these last 5 decades, telling us if the Earth's warming is not limited to 2C or less, it could get a lot worse, a lot quicker than perhaps you can even imagine. And that's a global view, but what does this look like at a particular site? You know, we didn't start at the world, we started in Craig's backyard. And so let's go back to New Mexico and zoom in on his site here. This is a place that Craig's been working for a long time, and we've got our global hotter drought fingerprint, but what I'm showing you up top here is the local hotter drought fingerprint for Craig's site. And on the y-axis is the number of these climate metrics, which are as bad or worse than the mortality year across 30 years of climate. And Craig already told you in 2002, a bunch of trees died, right? Like 95% of the opinion on this aspect. And yet our observed climatology says, hey, 2011 should have been pretty bad too. According to our fingerprint we defined, that year trees should have died. And Craig was there, and so he knows that they did. This is a photo from the following year where he's showing some trees that had recently died during that hotter drought event that happened. And so our fingerprint's actually sensitive, and then it kind of can pick up these recurrent mortality events, which is interesting. And across the warming of the chronology, you see at +2C, we pick up additional years that meet those all 6 conditions, or hotter or drier. And under +4C, it goes up. And this is a pretty stringent threshold to require that all 6 be there. I also want you to pay attention to the average position of the line. Here, it's below 2 thresholds on average across all years, whereas here it's more than 4. You know, 80% of the years between 85 and 2015 are 5 out of 6 of those climate metrics exceeded. So we don't know what that looks like for a forest, because that's not how the observed record looks, right? But we suspect that it cannot be good. This effort is really kind of what we view as an initial footing. So the database itself, our primary objective was to precisely georeference this global database of peer-reviewed studies, and it'll be made available as an open access resource on treemortality.net. This is an effort of the International Tree Mortality Network, which I'm a member of as a data manager, but also Craig's on the scientific advisory board. And so as soon as we get this paper published, this is all in review at the moment. You may have noticed I put press embargo on some of the slides. As soon as it gets published, which we're trying to do, all the data will be open access and available for anyone. So that if you want to validate your model, or you've got a different idea on how to approach the global or even local or regional tree mortality, this data could be put to use. And to that end, we hope to continue to ask others to contribute to it. So for observations from foresters and from additional peer-reviewed studies and even citizen scientists, we want to bring in additional data, because we view this as kind of a beginning. We need a precisely referenced database of where trees are dying on Earth. Lastly, I just want to say that while I led this effort in the paper that's in review, my co-authors, these folks did a lot of hard work to help me get the message right and to understand and interpret what was going on. And so thanks to them, and thanks to the funders who have kept the lights on while we think about what kills trees. And with that, I think we'd be happy to take questions.
Great, thank you so much, Bill and Craig. So you can feel free to keep sharing your screen if you think that's helpful for you. We do have 10 to 15 minutes for questions and answers, and I'll hand that over to Susie Coker to lead.
Hi, thanks, Craig and Bill. I was going to say that was great, but it was a little bit depressing, so I'll just say it was very informative. And we do have some questions from Adam. We had the question, in the plots with the mortality event, what were the forest structures that also played into these mortality events compared to the forest that didn't have one? Were they exceptionally tall, dense, old, specific species, or forest structure not matter in all of this work?
This is a really great question. What I would tell you is the initial approach to this data that we've taken is to ask more about the climate and not the structure or the biotic agents or the soil composition, or all these many different facets and axes that definitely matter and definitely influence these forest dynamics on a local scale. But due in part to just the desire to get this out there, that's not something we've really investigated or probed fully yet. The paper that we have in review doesn't even really consider it. And so if that's something that you're thinking about a lot and you're interested in, this is one of the reasons we want to make this database open access and public, is that so folks can ask those interesting questions and find out what's forest structure got to do with it. This is something that I think needs to be done. This database covers forest types from open savannas and woodlands, like in the West African Sahel, all the way to the redwoods, right? And everything in between. And so because of this, there's a lot of variation in structure across the database. There's a lot of variation in species composition. The 157 dominant species aren't the only species that were affected, but they're the ones that were primarily featured in the peer-reviewed papers that were documenting mortality. And so there's a lot of species diversity, and we know with that structural diversity be in there. At the global scale, it's somewhat remarkable to me that there might still be a similar amount of drought or heat exceedance. How much is too much for these forests of varied structure? But I think the real answer is we just don't know yet, but we're excited to get this data out there so that people can find out. I think it'll be good.
Just a quick comment on that. These are not random plots that Bill's pulled together, right? These are plots, most of them were out there for other reasons. And, you know, a hot drought occurred and people were able to then document what happened in those plots. But so, and a lot of times there were other plots in the network. Bill wasn't pulling those in. He worked with the authors, you know, the local people to determine which of those plots actually showed drought and heat-induced tree mortality. But to do that in any given local landscape, you would need a nice random, sufficiently large sample size of plots across the landscape gradients to answer those kind of questions.
Well, Craig, maybe to follow up on that, since you did a local scale, do you have an answer to that question at your local scale rather than at this global scale?
Well, and actually some of the best work on that, I think, has been stuff coming out of California where people have been looking at plots and where stuff's died and how much forest structure matters and plots where there's been treatments and not. And it's pretty clear that you can, in fact, I just last week, a modeling paper looking at the same kind of thing. I remember involved Naomi Tagg and some of the folks there with, I think, probably the Sierra CZO down there. But just that it makes a difference how many stems, how much leaf area, how much basal area. I mean, you use different metrics, but you know, trying to understand the water balance associated with these things. But basically, there's in New Mexico, we think because fire suppression for the century prior to the onset of this drought, basically 20th century fire suppression, allowed these forests to densify. And, you know, by the time we got to the early mid-90s, 1990s, we're probably at the maximum expression of biomass, leaf area, basal area that's physically possible in these landscapes in southwestern montane forests. And so that's being squeezed out of these systems now. You just can't maintain that much leaf area or biomass when water stress becomes as high as it is now. Even if we could keep fire out of these landscapes magically with a magic wand and not have them reset hard, that way they would still be in the process of readjusting to this stress. And that to some extent is a natural thing. Through time, we can see that right in that, I didn't emphasize that, but in that 1,000-year record of tree growth and forest drought stress, you know, this oscillation is going on. That's part of it's tied to the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, we believe, driving the frequency of El Nino La Ninas. But there's a tendency for forests during the wet decades to overgrow, if you will. They're competing for light and space, so they're growing tall, they're putting on leaf area, they need to do that to be able to compete above ground and not get squeezed out on relatively mesic sites anyway. But then when the dry times come, you get squeezed that you just can't maintain that much biomass. And so different trees behave different, but they give up leaf area first. Then they might partially die back, and then they completely die. And you see different variations of this in forests all around the world. And different angiosperms and gymnosperms look like they have, you know, there's some basic differences in their ability to do these things. As part of what makes it fascinating, trees don't live to be many hundreds or thousands of years old, even without the ability to be able to adjust. They can adjust their physiology, they can adjust their morphology. There's a lot of interactive things, which that's part of what makes process-based modeling of forest or tree responses to some set of stressors so challenging. But basically, one of the things we can do is reduce the density of the forests. You know, so the similar kinds of things that are done to reduce fire hazard for stand replacing fire, reduce those ladder fuels, reduce that overgrowth of young trees. The Sierra Nevada forests are pretty similar in the sense that high frequency, low severity surface fire was an important component of many of those forest types and was removed for a long time, and the forest kind of overgrew in that way. And so it's natural what's going on. At some level, it's getting squeezed out, but it's amplified by we let the forest overshoot more by fire suppression. And now the warming is amplifying the effect of this natural oscillation in the drought. So.
Okay, thanks. That was a good answer. We have additional questions. One question was from Derek Young. He said it was super interesting that the anonymously, thank you, wet pre-mortality conditions were part of the mortality fingerprint. Is there any speculation as to
Yeah, so the
why and what the reference period used for computing the z-score? Could you explain that?
Yes, that reference period was the full climatology, 1958 to 2019. And so I guess I'll just briefly say that while there is some chronic warming, obviously, across that long time window, we saw the rate of warming during mortality years across the 48 mortality years was significantly higher. So it's warming even faster at these sites or at least the hottest months are warming at a higher rate. The extremes are getting more extreme faster than the mean is getting warmer, right? So the mean warming is increasing across that period, but the extreme warming is increasing faster. And that's, to me, that's terrifying because I think about the triple threat, right? But regarding the anomalously wet pre-mortality conditions, yeah, we've got in the paper, there's a bit of a hand waving about it, but we think that this could be a real signal that it's interesting across all of these diverse global forests. There was a bit of perhaps good times before the fall, right? That these trees may be overshot structurally, and that adjustment that Craig spoke to that's really important, and that modularity that allows trees to persist and respond over time as their resources change. Maybe things just got a bit too fast, especially that's why we think these extremes getting more extreme at a faster rate is bad. There's less time to adjust before it gets so bad that your structure is now a liability, and that growth from the good years might be costing you your life. And so, yeah, I think that's certainly what we think may be going on, but it requires a lot more probing, probably. You know.
There's a paper I would highlight led by Alistair Jump, J-U-M-P, in Global Change Biology in 2017 about structural overshoot and sort of the continuum of forest dieback processes. But that paper, it sort of takes kind of self-thinning data. It takes an approach similar to all the self-thinning data that foresters have looked at, but applies it to this notion that during the good times, there's this overshoot structurally at the both individual and stand levels, or could be landscape levels. And I think we see that all over the place on the planet. That then gets squeezed out as the climate oscillates. That, you know, when something like water is limiting to a system, it's responding to these multi-year changes. So there's probably something real in there. It's interesting that in Bill's fingerprint, it's 4 years prior, not 1 or 2 or 3 years prior, that the wet, right? That was the strongest signal. I wonder what that looks like in different biomes and forest types around the planet. I mean, it's some of the cool questions that will get answered at some point here, I'm sure.
Great, thanks. I wonder also, you have a question from Alina Kanzler. Can you talk about the temporal scale of climate drivers? You talked about that pre-mortality event climate, but the drivers in general, we're using monthly observations. Why not seasonal or annual climatic water deficit?
This is a great question, and there are many ways, I think, to probe these data and ask what could have led to these events. And I chose initially monthly just because of all of the work that I've done with trees that led me to believe that there's that thin line, right? That these extreme moments, I thought if daily data existed, I might have used it. Because I think when it gets really hot, like during a heat wave for a few days, that can push the physiological dysfunction within a tree to a maximum beyond which they may not be able to recover. And so for me, I was interested in this monthly aspect, but I'm aware that at the global scale, while these reinforced extremes seem to be pretty common when you look across this large plot network we've established here, when we think about what leads to and predisposes the forest to that moment, that extreme moment, they may actually kill them. I imagine that these long antecedent dry conditions, these integrated periods of stress from a climatic water deficit or other standpoint might be involved. And so, yeah, I think that would be a really interesting way to look at this additionally. The other thing for me was the only timing information I had is about when mortality began. Of course, I don't ever tell you when mortality ended at these sites. And that's in part because there's so few people like Craig on a landscape that are studying in the same place for a long time. And so often this elevated mortality happens. You can't ignore it because like Craig showed you, you just can't look away from all these dead trees. And so people go in to study it. But these mortality events, we suspect, have really long tails and lag effects where some trees that maybe didn't initially die, they're still knocking back over the years. And I think that's something that's been seen in California as well with the recent hot droughts. So yeah, certainly many ways we could look at it, but my approach of monthly extremes was really trying to focus in on these moments that might be deciding the difference between living and dying.
Let's take 2 more minutes for questions so we preserve some time for a break for folks. This is a great discussion.
Okay, so I have 2 questions that I'm going to combine here since we don't have much time left. And they're questions about what can we do. Afforestation is seen as a strategy for net zero emissions. Will these plans be torpedoed by worsening tree mortality conditions, or is that better because young trees do better than old trees? And then there was another question about those old trees. What are your thoughts as to the fate of the large tall trees in particular? Can management, including thinning, be sufficient to save the big trees? So how should we think about small and big trees moving forward?
Well, I'll talk about big trees. The small tree maybe we'll save to the panel. It kind of, I think, goes there. I mean, there's the afforestation question. Obviously, you can change the species you use. And so there's a lot of opportunity there to kind of, put things out there moving forward that have better chance to grow and what we project to be the case. But for big old trees, the challenge they face is that, other than in the Lord of the Rings, they don't walk, they can't move, they're stuck where they are as the climate space is moving. So we can buy time for them, I think, by things like thinning from below and basically decrease the water stress on them during these kind of extreme events, the competition in that kind of way. But at some point, and this is the part we cannot actually project, with a lot of confidence yet, at some point it'll be too much. Is that going to be another ½ degree C? Is it another whatever? But at some point it's going to be too much. And because we can see we're bumping up against those margins all over the place. And it's further complicated by that it's not just physiological. It includes very strongly these biotic interactions, things like bark beetles and what bark beetles select for. And so, there's been great work done recently down out of Sequoia, and maybe we'll hear about it later. But in terms of where, certain bark beetles are looking for the bigger tree species. And so it looks like you might say that was physiological stress, but it has to do with other kinds of interactions in the system. So, and that's hard for us to manage for, right? In terms of the bark beetles and what they do once their population builds up.
I hate to cut off a really interesting discussion, but I'll remind everybody before we break until 10:05 that we have an hour-long panel discussion. So Bill and Craig will be rejoining us, members of our short talks, and so we can really continue the discussion rolling. We're preserving your questions in a separate document so we can come back to some of those. So let's take a short break, and at 10:05